Previously, I'd mentioned or in previous discussions, I'd mentioned the Caribbean and relations with Barbados, for example, and the territory known now as South Carolina. The slave trade, sugar, things along those lines. The Caribbean, in this point in history, had largely been controlled by the Spaniards, although their control was somewhat tenuous because the majority of Spanish colonialization in the Caribbean centered around some of the larger islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. And while the Spaniards were off fighting against the Dutch for other different parts of the Caribbean or elsewhere, they were distracted. English settlers moved into other different areas along the Caribbean. And therefore, they were able to establish some of their influence there. And that's how you had some English outposts, including slave outposts in the Caribbean that could trade with English North America now. And so that's how a lot of it was driven. Now, I mentioned sugar in South Carolina. That was very true. However, the Caribbean climate is more especially suited for sugar, partially because sugar requires a warm climate, and in the Caribbean, you have a year-round warm climate. It doesn't get cold in the Caribbean. So you typically have more temperate to hot climates that are more humid, more conducive to receiving precipitation. It's typically going to be hot and humid along the Gulf Stream, and so you're going to have more opportunity to grow sugar. Sugar is very labor intensive. To be able to harvest cane, it is very labor intensive. But Europe had a strong hunger for sugar, if you will. And if you've ever had a cupcake, you kind of understand why, right? It's like, God, this stuff is awesome. I love sugar. It's bad for you. You don't want a lot of sugar. But it tastes good. And it makes things taste sweet. So Europe and other parts of the world develop a strong taste for sugar, which increases the demand. And because it's so labor intensive, you need more and more people to work it. So therefore, because of the sugar trade, you have a large expansion of African slavery, and the Caribbean is now going to be the hub for where African slaves will now be sent. Not just to North America, but to other places around the Caribbean and then in South America. As prevalent as slavery would become in what we know as North America and eventually the United States, it was nowhere near as large as what you would see in other European colonies, such as Brazil, for example, Portuguese colony. As bad as slavery was in what would become the United States, it was only a mere shadow of what it would be in Brazil. That's not to excuse anything. That's just to give you an idea as to how big the slave trade would eventually become. When Brazil had far higher the rates of slavery than the United States eventually would. That's how big the slave trade got. And the Caribbean was the hub where slaves would be brought from Africa and then moved to various different parts of the Americas. More likely to somewhere in South America, but obviously a lot to North American colonies in English North America and parts of other parts as well. Sugar in particular is so labor intensive that more and more slaves would be needed, not just because you'd have more of a demand, but because it produced a very high death rate. So a very, very labor intensive crop to harvest and grow, typically grown and harvested in a very, very hot and humid climate, is going to produce a recipe for disaster. You're going to have slaves that are going to live very, very harsh lives that are going to be labor intensive, and typically their lives are going to be very short because they're going to do hard work in the hot sun all day, pretty much every day. And it's labor intensive. So slave labor creates a moving market, if you will, and an ever-growing market, because you need more labor and then you need to replace that labor. So you have more and more Europeans involved in the sugar trade that are going to be involved in the slave trade because of the necessity for cheap labor. So anywhere you would have pockets of slaves, you're going to start creating slave cultures, if you will. And Afro-Caribbean culture would come to prominence in this era, as you would have Africans who had observed many of their own religious entities and be introduced to new entities like Christian ideologies, and they would merge the two in many different stances. Slaves oftentimes would not have much of their own, but they would have their faith that they could perhaps practice on their own time. So they would develop many of their own social traditions, and maybe their faith is the one thing they had that was independent of their master's control. And so you have Afro-Caribbean society that would grow and develop and produce a strong influence all throughout the Caribbean. So you have the Spaniards in the Caribbean, you have the English now in the Caribbean, you have a massive slave trade in the Caribbean that is centered in and around there. And then, of course, you have a source for slaves to be sent to various different areas on the mainland. So the Caribbean is now the hub, but that's where you go get your slaves. They're imported from Africa, dragged there really, we'll talk about that later, and they're sent to various different places. Now, going back to the Spaniards. The Spaniards had set up shop in their Nueva España, in their New Spain capital of Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, which would be renamed. And they had settled into various different areas, modern-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. Although some of those colonies would be more sparsely populated. In the 1600s, Texas did not have much of a Spanish population. Very sparse. The Spaniards had built various different outposts in North America. St. Augustine, the very first one. And then Santa Fe, New Mexico, the second one. New Mexico, by the way, would be the most prominent, or rather most prosperous, Spanish colony in the American Southwest. The Spaniards oftentimes decimated Native American populations throughout the Southwest, largely because of exposure to various different diseases such as smallpox or otherwise. And they would also establish an encomienda system. Basically, an encomienda system under the Spaniards was an idea that the Native Americans would be put to work for the Spaniards and pay tribute, therefore having a right to exist or therefore be incorporated into new Hispanic society. The encomienda system would dominate much of the American Southwest for the better part of several centuries. Okay? And that's another reason that we mentioned, especially after Chapter 1, how there was a mixing of Spanish and Native American cultures in a mestizo form, both racially and otherwise. And the encomienda system was part of it, as you have Spanish outposts, missions, you have forts that were also built to protect Spanish settlers from incursions from natives or from other European entities. You have more of that mixing. So Spain had to kind of reshift some of their thinking around some of their colonies when the French became more involved in North America. So the Spaniards had control of Florida. Immediately to their north were the English. The Spaniards also had control of the American Southwest, including Texas. The French would make their way down from Canada down the Mississippi River all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and claim that as sovereign French colonial territory. They would establish the territory of Louisiana. And just to the east of Texas, you would have a French colony. That was a threat to the Spanish. And so, in order to preserve Spanish colonial sovereignty, the Spanish viceroyalty in Nueva España, under direction from the king back in Spain, mandated that Texas would now have to be populated and therefore protected Texas would become a buffer from French incursion into other different parts of Maine, New Spain. So you would have various different missions and forts built throughout East Texas, and then you would also have some built in Central Texas and elsewhere along the Rio Grande. The modern-day Alamo, Misión San Antonio de Valero, also known as the Alamo, would be built in 1730 as a partial fort and a mission to convert local natives, but to also establish a Spanish colonial presence in south central Texas. And you would have other incursions elsewhere to keep the French from incurring elsewhere into parts of New Spain. Okay, so the Spaniards were threatened by the English and the French. Conversely, I mentioned the Spaniards also controlled Florida. Okay, well, just to the north of Florida, you have modern-day Georgia. Georgia sits between the Carolinas and Florida. Georgia was not claimed by the Spaniards. The Spaniards basically claimed what is present-day Florida and in throughout the modern-day Florida panhandle all the way into small parts of like southern Alabama and Mississippi, around Biloxi, Gulf Shores, places around there. Okay? In order to protect English settlement from Spanish incursion up north, John Oglethorpe was tasked with creating an area to serve the needs of the English Empire by creating a buffer south of South Carolina between Spanish Florida. We would know this territory to be named after King George. We know it as the state of Georgia today. Georgia was basically created as a buffer to protect the English colonies from Spanish incursion up from Florida. And thereby, you contain your Spanish rival, who feels threatened by you, by the way, but you create that buffer in a new opportunity in a climate that's also conducive for agriculture. So the English, under Oglethorpe, create a colony along one of the major rivers in Georgia. We know it today as Savannah. And you create a society in Georgia that's now largely there to grow crops and protect the rest of the English colonies from Spanish incursion. So that is how Georgia is established. Those are the dynamics of the Caribbean, the slave trade, and the rest of North America with the other European powers at the time.